There is a particular kind of arrogance that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It moves through the world in the form of certainty, the bone-deep, unexamined certainty that certain things simply cannot happen to certain people. The man on the 62nd floor of a lakefront Chicago tower had that certainty the way other men have a heartbeat. It wasn't a belief he'd arrived at through experience. It was a premise he'd never once been asked to defend. And 3 weeks before the night that changed that, someone had the courtesy to warn him. He had the card framed. That detail matters. Not because it tells you something about his taste in interior design. It tells you everything about the distance between what he thought the card was. A stunt, a provocation, a performance by someone beneath him, and what the card actually was. A calendar entry. The gentleman does not send warnings, he sends schedules. If you've been with this channel before, you already know what that means. If you're new here, stay. What you're about to hear is the story of how one of the most fortified private residences in the city was entered, its most sensitive materials removed, and its owner left with a framed piece of his own humiliation sitting on an empty shelf. The security team filed a report that ran 47 pages. The report contained no answer to the only question that mattered. By the time anyone thought to ask it, the asking was already beside the point. If this is the kind of story you come here for, hit like before you forget. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a reasonable time to reconsider that. There's more where this comes from, and you'll want to be there when it lands. But first, when someone tells you exactly what they're going to do, and you don't believe them, what does that say about you? Hold that question. We'll come back to it. The card arrived on a Tuesday in late October, delivered by hand to the building's concierge desk with instructions to bring it to the 62nd floor. The concierge did not open it. The concierge had worked in that building for 11 years and understood with the precision of someone whose livelihood depended on that understanding what he was and was not supposed to touch. He brought it upstairs in a small silver tray, set it on the foyer table, and retreated without being asked. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, sealed with a wax emboss that the building's head of security later described as the kind of thing you see in period films. Inside was a single card, handwritten in a clean, unhurried script. It gave a date, 3 weeks out. It named one item, a file package referenced by the internal designation the target used for his most sensitive documents, a designation that existed in exactly 3 places in the world, none of them accessible to anyone outside his inner circle. And at the bottom, below the date and the item, 3 words. I'll see myself in. He read the card twice. Then he laughed. Not the laugh of someone who finds something funny, but the specific clipped laugh of someone who has just been handed something they consider beneath their consideration. He set the card on the desk, called his head of security, read the relevant portions aloud, and listened to the response. Then he made a decision that, at the time, seemed entirely rational, and, in retrospect, was the most important decision he made. Not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly right, and the gentleman had counted on it being exactly right. He had the card framed. Gold leaf, non-reflective glass mounted in his study where he could see it from his desk. A trophy. Proof that someone had tried to rattle him and failed. That was the story he told himself, and the story he told the 3 colleagues he showed it to in the weeks that followed, each of whom laughed with him in the way people laugh when they are in the presence of someone who controls things they need. The gentleman was not rattled. The gentleman was not even particularly concerned with whether the target was rattled. What he needed was for the target to do exactly what someone with that much certainty would do when handed a challenge. Respond with force, add layers, create noise. The framed card was a confirmation. It meant the target had understood the card as theater. It meant he would perform accordingly. And now you know why the framing mattered. The target's name had been attached to money for so long that the two things had become effectively synonymous. He had not inherited his position so much as constructed it over the course of 2 decades through a specific and repeatable strategy that the financial press had written about with the kind of admiring restraint that gets applied to people who operate near the edge of what is legal and always manage to land on the right side of the line. The strategy was this: find municipalities in financial distress, find the pension funds those municipalities were responsible for, and find the moment, always brief, always manufactured partly by his own legal team's filings, when those funds became eligible for acquisition through bankruptcy proceedings. Then acquire them, then restructure them, then liquidate the portions that could be liquidated through a chain of shell entities that were, each individually, compliant with every applicable regulation, and which together constituted a mechanism for transferring the retirement savings of teachers and sanitation workers and municipal clerks into a set of holding structures that paid distributions to a very small number of people, none of whom had ever attended a PTA meeting, or collected garbage, or processed a building permit. He had done this 4 times in 14 years. The 4th time, a deputy comptroller in a mid-sized Midwestern city had flagged the transaction structure to a journalist who had written about it in a publication that reached the people most directly affected. There had been hearings. There had been a period of approximately 8 months during which the target's name appeared in print more often than he preferred. And then the deputy comptroller had taken a job with a regulatory body that the target's political donations had helped staff, and the journalist had moved on to a different beat, and the article had aged into the archive, and the people most directly affected had continued to be affected, and the target had continued to operate. He had, in the language he used with the people in his circle, navigated it. This was the phrase: not survived, not endured, not been held accountable, and been found insufficient to the standard. Navigated, the way a competent sailor navigates weather, not by changing course, but by understanding that the storm will pass and the heading can be maintained. The gentleman had read the article. He had read the hearing transcripts. He had read the regulatory filings and the shell entity registrations and the distribution records that were technically public and practically invisible. He had done this over a period of several weeks with the attention of someone assembling a piece of furniture from a set of instructions written in a language they don't speak. Methodical, patient, consulting the diagram again and again until the picture came clear. He was not angry when the picture came clear. The gentleman does not operate from anger. Anger is expensive and imprecise, and the gentleman does not waste either money or attention. What he felt, if it could be named, was the specific satisfaction of a craftsman who has identified the exact nature of the problem he has been asked to solve. The document package referenced in the card was not a random target. It was the 4th transaction's internal records, the working files, the entity maps, the communication logs between the legal team and the shell structure administrators. The kind of documentation that, in the hands of the right journalist or the right federal investigator, would not merely continue the story that had been buried in the archive. It would reopen it with interest. The target kept these files in his vault. not in a cloud system, not in a law firm's document management platform, in a physical vault, on a secured residential floor, in a building that had been chosen in part because of what it was willing to provide for the right annual maintenance fee. When he received the card, he did not call the journalist. He did not call a lawyer to discuss the implications of someone possessing that internal designation. He called his head of security. And then, after that call, he called the firm that managed his digital and physical security perimeter and told them he wanted a full review of the 62nd floor's access protocols before the date on the card. That call was the beginning of the end of his certainty, though he would not know it for another 3 weeks. The building had been constructed in the late 90s as a mixed-use tower, and the 62nd floor had been converted to its current configuration about 6 years prior, when the target had purchased the full floor and hired a firm that specialized in what their materials called residential security integration. What this meant, concretely, was the following. The elevator bank serving the 62nd floor was segregated from the building's main elevator system and required a biometric credential, a palm scan, enrolled only for individuals the target had personally approved, to receive a call. The stairwell exits to the floor were alarmed and monitored independently of the building's main fire safety system, on a separate circuit managed by the security firm. The front entry to the residential space itself was equipped with a dual authentication lock, keypad code plus a secondary biometric that changed on a rolling 30-day cycle. The interior of the space included the vault room, which was a separate construction within the larger floor plan rated for fire, impact, and equipped with its own power supply and monitoring unit. The vault itself required a physical key and a 10-digit code that the target changed manually and told to no one. The perimeter outside the building had 2 layers, a contracted security detail that rotated in 8-hour shifts and kept a log of everyone who approached the residential entrance on the building's north face, and a digital monitoring system that tracked network traffic into and out of the secured floor, flagging anomalies against a baseline that had been calibrated over 18 months. After receiving the card, the target security review identified what the firm considered 3 potential vectors of concern and addressed each of them with additional measures. The elevator was put on a second biometric layer, iris scan added at the call button panel. The stairwell exits received motion sensors in the corridor sections below and above the 62nd floor. The north face security detail was expanded from 1 to 3 personnel during the hours between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., with a 4th stationed at the building's service entrance. And the digital perimeter was updated with a new monitoring protocol that flagged any device connecting to the building's network infrastructure within signal range of the 62nd floor. He showed the updated security schematic to 2 of his colleagues. He pointed to the grid of coverage lines and said, in the specific tone he used when he had decided something was finished, that whoever had sent the card was welcome to try. There is a thing that happens to people who have enough money to build a sufficient number of layers around themselves. They begin to mistake the layers for the thing being protected. The layers become the story they tell about themselves. Proof of seriousness, proof of substance, proof that the space inside the perimeter is worth defending. And the more seriously they take the layers, the more completely they stop thinking about what exists between them. The gentleman had been thinking about what existed between the layers for considerably longer than the security firm had been thinking about the layers themselves. He had begun his observation of the building 4 months before the card was sent, and what he was observing was not the security architecture. He was observing the people the security architecture required in order to function. Not the guards, not the monitoring firm's operators, not the concierge who carried cards on silver trays. The people below those people, the ones whose presence in the building was not access. It was infrastructure. Every secured building of sufficient complexity has a category of personnel that its security model treats as environmental rather than human. They are present in the spaces between access events. They move through corridors at hours when movement is not expected. Their work requires them to be in contact with systems, physical, mechanical, electrical, that are, by operational necessity, outside the monitoring perimeter. Not because someone decided they weren't a threat, because the model that defines threat was built by people whose experience of these individuals is as background, as context, as the reason the building functions without requiring the people who live in it to think about functioning. The target had, in the 6 years of his residence on the 62nd floor, interacted with this category of personnel a total of 0 times, not because they were never present, because he did not see them. Not as an act of dismissal, as an act of architecture. They were not in his model of the space. They moved through a version of the building that existed parallel to his version, touching the same physical surfaces, operating in the same corridors, and never, in any meaningful sense, occupying the same world. The gentleman occupied both worlds without difficulty. He had spent 3 weeks in the building before the card was sent, not on the 62nd floor, not in the residential sections, but in the mechanical and service infrastructure that the building's management contracted out in segments to 3 different firms. The work was real work. The credentials were legitimate. The name on the credentials was not a name that appeared on any document the target had ever seen or would think to look for. The gentleman did not break any access protocol. He did not bypass any security system. He arrived when he was supposed to arrive, completed the work he was assigned to complete, and left through the appropriate exit. What he was doing in those 3 weeks was learning the building's second language, the one spoken by the people who keep the lights on. There are things you can only know from the inside. The exact interval between a particular automated cycle and the manual check that follows it, the precise routing of a specific maintenance corridor, and which section of it is covered by a camera that has been running on a 45-day replacement cycle that the building's facilities manager has not yet submitted the purchase order for. The shift handoff time for the service-level personnel and the 7-minute window it creates. The location of the mechanical room that sits directly below the 62nd floor and the access panel within it that is part of a system the residential security integration firm had specified should be coordinated with building management, and which, in the 6 years since installation, had been coordinated in the sense that both parties knew it existed. He also learned one other thing, which became the center of everything. The security upgrade the target ordered after receiving the card required the presence, on 3 consecutive nights in the week before the marked date, of a specialized contractor team. The kind of team whose work requires access to the mechanical and electrical systems of the floor directly below the secured space. The kind of work that, for liability and insurance reasons, is performed under a blanket clearance issued by building management, rather than a specific credential check for each individual. The kind of work that generates a paper trail in facilities management and almost no trail anywhere else. Think about that for a moment. The target spent significant resources adding layers to his security perimeter. Each new layer required installation. Installation required contractors. Contractors working on the secure floor's supporting infrastructure required exactly the kind of access that exists between the layers of the system being upgraded. The more thoroughly he fortified, the more thoroughly he opened the one door he had never thought to lock. because it was not, in his model, a door. Have you ever made something worse by trying to make it better? Have you ever added protection to something and only later realized the protection was the exposure? Think about where that's happened in your own life. It's not a comfortable question, but it's the one this story keeps asking. The gentleman did not enter the 62nd floor on the night marked on the card. He entered on the night before. This matters because the target's security detail was calibrated to the marked date, expanded coverage, heightened alert, all eyes on the perimeter as the clock approached midnight. On the night before, the detail was at standard deployment, not reduced, standard, which meant 3 fewer bodies on the north face, no iris scanner active at the elevator call panel because the second biometric layer was still in the installation window per the upgrade schedule, and the mechanical contractor team completing their third and final night of work on the 59th and 60th floors. The gentleman was part of that team in the sense that his name appeared on the blanket clearance, and his tools were in the equipment case, and the building's facilities manager had spoken to him twice over the 3 nights, and found nothing to say about either conversation. He was present in the building in the most legitimate possible sense, documented, cleared, expected. What he did between his last documented position and his first documented position the following morning is not in the facilities log. Not because the log was altered, because the log records presence at check-in and check-out, not the geography of the hours between them. What happened in those hours is described by its consequences. At 6:14 in the morning, on the day before the date marked on the card, the target's head of security arrived at the 62nd floor for a pre-dawn walkthrough that had become part of his routine in the weeks since the card arrived. He was thorough. He checked the entry, the vault room, the perimeter monitoring logs. He found everything in order. He made a note in his daily report that the pre-dawn status was normal and that the detail was prepared for the following night. He did not check the interior of the vault. The vault's external monitoring unit showed no access event. The vault's physical key was on the target's person. There was no reason to check the interior of the vault. At 9:47 that morning, the target came into his study to take a call. The call was with a member of his legal team regarding an unrelated matter. Before the call connected, he looked at the framed card on the wall, as he had looked at it most mornings since it had been mounted there. It had become a kind of ritual, a brief inventory of his own security in the form of a displayed provocation that had produced nothing. The card was not on the wall. He found it on the shelf inside the vault, lying flat on the surface where the document package had been. The document package was gone. The vault was otherwise undisturbed. The key was still in his possession. The external monitoring unit still showed no access event. The dual authentication entry to the residential space had not been triggered by any credential other than his own and his head of securities, both of which were accounted for. He stood in front of the open vault for a long time, long enough that the call he had been about to take went to voicemail, long enough that his head of security, summoned by a message that was 3 words and a punctuation mark, arrived and stood beside him, and also stood silently for a moment before either of them said anything. The framed card had been removed from the wall and placed on the shelf with a care that was itself a statement. The frame was undamaged. The non-reflective glass was clean. It had been set down flat, face up, so that the handwritten text was visible above the empty surface where the document package had been. The date on the card was tomorrow. There are moments when a person with significant resources and a practiced relationship with the language of control discovers that neither the resources nor the language applies to what is in front of them. This was one of those moments. He could not call the police. The documents were not, by any definition, he could safely use with law enforcement, the kind of materials whose theft he could report and describe without describing their contents. He could not call his lawyers because the first question any lawyer would ask was the same question he had no way to answer. He could not announce to the colleagues he had shown the framed card to that the card had been moved, because that announcement would require him to explain where it had been moved to and what had been on the shelf beneath it. He could not do anything. That was the calling card's second message. It was not merely a record of what had been taken. It was a document of what could not be done about it. His head of security filed a 47-page internal report over the following week. The report examined every access credential, every monitoring log, every camera record, every shift roster, every contractor clearance from the previous 60 days. It identified no anomalous access event. It identified no individual who should not have been in the building and was. It identified no mechanism by which the vault could have been accessed without the physical key and the code. The report concluded, in the careful language of a professional who has been asked to explain something they cannot explain, that the access method was undetermined, and that the most likely vector involved a level of premeditation and operational sophistication beyond standard threat modeling parameters. This was accurate. It was also in every practical sense useless. The document package did not appear in the press that week or the month after. A journalist who had covered the original story received a package in the mail 8 weeks later. Not the documents themselves, but a precise and detailed summary of their contents, organized by transaction and cross-referenced against the public filings in a way that was, as she later described it to a colleague, the kind of work that takes someone 6 months or a very good memory. She published a follow-up story. It was longer than the original. It was more specific. It named the regulatory appointments and the timeline of the comptroller's departure with a clarity that the original piece had not achieved. The story was picked up. There were new hearings. The mechanisms that had previously navigated the situation were somewhat less navigable this time. The target did not frame the follow-up story. In the weeks after the vault was found empty, the gentleman was somewhere that was not Chicago, doing work that was not discussed in 47-page reports. He did not think about the target with satisfaction or contempt. He thought about him the way a builder thinks about a structure they have finished, as a completed thing, still standing, now serving a different purpose than its owner had intended. There was a woman named Denise who had worked for the city in the municipal clerk's office for 22 years. She had been, by every account that the gentleman had encountered in his research, a person who did her work carefully and without drama, and who had, at a specific point in a specific year, signed off on a filing that had been represented to her as routine, and which had been one link in a chain she was never shown in full. She had not been implicated in the hearings. She had not been asked to testify. She had retired 2 years earlier with a pension that was, because of what the target had done to the fund it was drawn from, approximately 40% of what it should have been. She was not the only person in that situation. She was the one whose name appeared in a footnote in one of the hearing transcripts, attributed to a comment she had made to a reporter outside the hearing room. Something about her husband's medication costs and what she had expected her retirement to look like and what it actually looked like. The gentleman had read that footnote in the same sitting in which he read the rest of the transcript. He had not noted it as a separate action. He had simply read it, and it had stayed. The follow-up story included her name. It included her comment from the hearing, quoted accurately, placed in a context that made clear what the fund's liquidation had meant to people who had contributed to it for decades. The journalist had found Denise through the transcript and called her, and Denise had spoken to her for an hour because there was nothing she was afraid of and nothing she had to hide, and because someone had finally called. The gentleman did not know any of this until later. He hadn't arranged it. It was simply what happened when the right information reached the right person. He thought about that for a while. How much of what he did was set up, and how much of it was simply clearing the space for what was always going to happen once someone could see clearly. He had a code, not a written code, not a list of principles he carried around and consulted, a set of commitments that had been tested enough times to be load-bearing. One of them was this: the people who caused a harm and navigated away from it were not the only actors in the story. There were people who had absorbed the harm without being part of the cause, and the story was not finished until their part of it had been named. Not fixed. He had no power to give Denise her full pension, but named. Put in a form that could not be as easily navigated away from as the original form had been. He did not consider this generosity. He considered it accounting. There was another thing he had thought about in the weeks after the vault and before the journalist's package, and it was the question of the framed card. Not the card itself, not the gesture of having moved it. The original framing. The way the target had taken something that was meant to be taken seriously and turned it into a decoration. Not a mistake. A habit. The habit of converting everything that could threaten the story you tell about yourself into evidence for the story you tell about yourself. The warning becomes a trophy. The trophy becomes the wall. And the wall, in the end, becomes the thing that shows you exactly where you were standing when you stopped seeing clearly. He thought about that habit and where else it operated. He thought about the people in Denise's situation and the ways they had received warnings, about the fund, about the structure, about what the filings meant, and the ways those warnings had been managed and reframed and eventually mounted on the wall. He thought about the distance between the 62nd floor and the apartment Denise had described in the hearing transcript, and how much of that distance was made of exactly that habit. The conversion of warnings into trophies, of accountability into performance, of other people's losses into a grid of coverage lines on a security schematic. He thought about what it cost to take a warning seriously, not what it would have cost the target. That math was simple and uninteresting. What it costs anyone. The warning that arrives in a form you didn't expect, from a direction you weren't watching. The one that doesn't carry credentials or make an appointment. The one that requires you to sit with the possibility that the story you've been telling about yourself is not the only story in the room. That's a different kind of vault. Most people spend their whole lives building it and never once wonder who might have the key. You stayed for the whole story. That means something, and it's not nothing that you did. Here's what this episode actually was, under the heist mechanics and the security schematics and the framed card on the shelf. It was a story about what happens when someone refuses to believe that consequences apply to them. Not because they're unintelligent, not even because they're wrong about their own competence, but because their entire operating model is built on the premise that warnings are things that happen to other people, that the gap between what they've done and what can be done about it is managed permanently by the layers they've built. The gentleman doesn't win because he's smarter. He wins because he takes seriously the things other people have decided not to take seriously. That's a quieter edge than people expect, but it doesn't miss. The game isn't rigged because the people on top are better players. It's rigged because they got to decide which moves count as moves. He just learned to play the board they weren't watching. If this story landed, if there's a moment in it you're still sitting with, Share it with someone who would understand why. And subscribe if you haven't. Not because this channel needs the number, but because the next story is already in motion, and it would be a shame to miss it when it arrives. One last question before you go. Is there something you've been warned about? By someone? By a situation? By your own instincts? That you've been treating like a decoration instead of a signal? You don't have to answer out loud, but you do have to answer.